The first morning in the new settlement arrived without celebration. There were no grand speeches, no carved monuments, and no certainty that the small community would remain for years to come. Instead, the day began the same way countless mornings had begun across the Viking world, with work. The sea was calm. A thin mist drifted over the shoreline, softening the outlines of distant rocks. Gulls circled overhead, their calls echoing across the quiet bay. One by one, the settlers stepped outside their temporary shelters and looked toward another unfamiliar day. Every task mattered. Before long, the settlement would need proper houses, dry storage for food, safe places for tools, and warm fires that could survive the coming autumn. Unlike modern builders, these families could not simply order supplies from somewhere else. Nearly everything had to come from the land around them. Fortunately, this new country offered something Greenland could rarely provide: wood. Tall trees stood across nearby hills, their trunks promising beams for roofs, planks for repairs, and fuel for countless fires. For Greenlanders, where large timber was remarkably scarce, the sight must have felt almost unbelievable. Groups of men carried axes into the forest. Their iron blades, carefully forged and sharpened, struck the trunks with slow, steady rhythm. Each swing echoed through the trees. The work demanded patience rather than speed. A fallen tree represented days of effort still ahead: cutting, trimming, carrying, shaping, and finally fitting each piece into a structure that could withstand northern weather. Meanwhile, others remained near the shoreline. The ships that had carried them across the Atlantic needed constant attention. Salt water slowly weakened wood. Ropes frayed. Sails required repairs. Without healthy ships, there could be no journey home. In many ways, the longships remained the settlement's greatest lifeline. Far from home, they were not simply transportation, they were security. They were hope. Nearby, several women organized the growing collection of supplies. Food was carefully counted. Barrels were inspected. Animal hides were dried beneath the cool breeze. Simple cooking fires produced warm meals that offered comfort after long hours of labor. Archaeology reminds us that Viking settlements depended upon cooperation. Every person contributed according to skill and necessity. There were blacksmiths who repaired tools, carpenters who shaped timber, hunters who searched nearby forests, fishermen who understood changing tides, weavers who transformed wool into warm clothing. Children also played important roles. Although modern imagination often separate childhood from responsibility, young people in Viking communities learned practical skills from an early age. They gathered firewood, collected fresh water, helped care for animals, watched older family members closely, slowly preparing for adulthood. Their education came not from classrooms, but from daily life itself. As the days passed, the settlement slowly took shape. Instead of tall wooden cabins, many buildings followed a familiar Norse tradition. They were constructed using thick walls made from layers of turf placed over sturdy wooden frames. These turf houses blended naturally into the surrounding landscape. From a distance, they almost appeared to grow from the earth itself. The design was practical. Heavy turf acted as insulation. During harsh winters, it trapped warmth inside while protecting families from powerful northern winds. Although simple by modern standards, these homes reflected generations of experience living in cold climates. Inside, life remained surprisingly organized. A long central room often served multiple purposes. Families cooked meals there, shared stories, repaired clothing, crafted tools, and when darkness arrived early, everyone gathered around the fire, where light flickered gently across timber beams overhead. Smoke escaped from openings in the roof, though some always lingered inside. Visitors today might find such homes dark and smoky. For the settlers, however, they represented safety. Outside, exploration continued. Small groups ventured farther from camp each day. They carefully observed rivers, forests, and coastlines. Every discovery added another piece to their understanding of this unfamiliar land. Which streams held fish? Where did animals travel? Which plants could be safely gathered? Where could ships land during changing tides? Knowledge accumulated slowly. The landscape revealed itself only to those willing to watch patiently. The surrounding waters proved generous. Fish filled the cold Atlantic. Salmon moved through nearby rivers. Shellfish could be gathered along rocky shores. These natural resources reduced pressure on stored supplies brought from Greenland. Still, experienced settlers understood one important truth: summer abundance never guaranteed winter survival. Preparation could never stop. One particularly valuable task involved producing iron. Modern people often overlook how precious iron truly was. Every nail, knife, axe, fishing hook, and woodworking tool depended upon it. Without regular repairs, everyday life became increasingly difficult. Archaeologists later discovered evidence of a small Norse smithy at Lonsdale Meadows. This remarkable finding suggested that settlers produced iron locally, most likely from bog iron collected nearby. The process required skill. Iron-rich material was heated inside a furnace fueled by charcoal. Temperatures had to be carefully controlled. The resulting metal then required repeated hammering before becoming useful tools. It was slow work, demanding work, yet essential. The steady ringing of hammer against hot iron may once have echoed across the settlement, mixing with waves, seabirds, and the distant sound of axes cutting timber. As weeks became months, confidence slowly grew. The unfamiliar coastline no longer seemed entirely foreign. Footpaths connected buildings, woodpiles increased, fishing grounds became familiar. Nearby forests felt less mysterious. The settlers began recognizing landmarks that had once appeared identical. A crooked pine, a narrow stream, a rocky hill overlooking the bay. Little by little, the land became part of memory. Still, reminders of distance remained impossible to ignore. Beyond the Atlantic lay Greenland. Farther still stood Iceland, and beyond those islands waited Norway, the ancestral homeland many adults still remembered. Letters could not cross the ocean. Messages traveled only when ships did. If storms prevented voyages, families might remain isolated for many months. Such isolation demanded emotional resilience as much as physical endurance. Evenings often brought quieter moments. The day's work finally complete, families gathered around gentle fires. Simple meals were shared, bread baked from precious grain stores, fresh fish roasted over glowing embers, occasional meat from hunting expeditions. Perhaps someone carved wood while another repaired clothing. Perhaps older voices repeated familiar stories carried across generations, not tales meant to glorify violence, but stories that reminded children where they came from and why courage sometimes meant simply enduring another difficult season. Outside, northern twilight lingered.
Summer evenings stretched long across the horizon. The sea reflected soft shades of silver and blue. Almost everything felt peaceful. Yet no settlement could survive on comfort alone. Exploration had only begun. Beyond the familiar shoreline stretched forests that seemed endless. Unknown rivers disappeared into distant valleys. Signs of other people occasionally appeared, subtle traces that suggested these newcomers were not entirely alone in this vast landscape. The Vikings had crossed an ocean to reach this place. Soon, they would discover that the greatest challenge was not building houses or repairing ships. It was learning how to live in a land that already had its own history. In the next part, we will quietly explore daily life inside the Viking settlement and the first careful sign.
Morning arrived quietly over the small Norse settlement. The first light of day spread slowly across the bay, turning the calm water into a sheet of pale silver. A cool breeze carried the scent of salt, damp earth, and fresh-cut timber. Before long, thin streams of smoke began rising from the turf-covered houses as families prepared for another ordinary day at the edge of the known world. By now, the settlement no longer felt entirely temporary. Footpaths connected each building. Firewood had been stacked beside the walls. Fishing nets hung carefully to dry after each day's catch. Wooden barrels stood outside the houses, collecting rainwater whenever the clouds passed overhead. Although small, the village had begun to develop its own quiet rhythm. For the settlers, routine was more valuable than excitement. Every familiar task created stability. Every successful day increased the chances of surviving another season. Inside one of the larger turf houses, the fire had likely burned throughout the night. Keeping a fire alive was easier than starting a new one every morning. Before sunrise, glowing embers would still rest beneath the ashes, waiting for someone to gently stir them back into bright flames. Soon the room filled with warmth once again. Breakfast was simple, perhaps dried fish left over from earlier catches, fresh bread if flour remained, a little butter or cheese from livestock brought across the Atlantic. Nothing was wasted. Every piece of food represented countless hours of work. The settlers understood something modern societies rarely experience. Supplies could not simply be replaced. If food disappeared too quickly, there would be no nearby market to visit. Everything depended upon careful planning. After eating, the village slowly came alive. Some men carried axes toward the forest, where fresh timber remained one of the greatest resources of the settlement. Others walked toward the shoreline with fishing lines, nets, and small boats. Several prepared hunting equipment before disappearing among the trees. Women organized much of the settlement's daily life. They cooked meals, repaired clothing, cared for children, processed wool, preserved food, and often worked beside the men whenever extra hands were needed. Historical evidence shows that Viking women held important responsibilities within their communities. Their labor was essential to survival, especially in isolated settlements where every individual mattered. Children filled the spaces between these daily routines. Some chased one another across the grassy hills. Others followed adults, eager to learn practical skills. A young boy might watch his father repair an axe handle. A young girl might learn how to spin wool into thread. Little by little, knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next. There were no written instruction books. Experience itself became the teacher. The blacksmith remained among the busiest people in the village. Inside the small workshop, iron glowed bright orange within the furnace. The heat contrasted sharply with the cool northern air outside. Each strike of the hammer shaped another useful object. A broken nail became whole again. A dull knife recovered its sharp edge. An axe received a stronger blade. Iron was precious. Even small fragments were carefully saved. Nothing useful was thrown away. Archaeologists later discovered evidence that the settlers produced iron from bog ore, making Lance Almenos one of the earliest known ironworking sites established by Europeans in North America. This discovery tells us something important. The village was more than a campsite. It possessed the tools and skills needed to support longer voyages and extended stays. Outside the workshop, another group repaired one of the longships. The Atlantic Ocean showed little mercy. Salt water slowly weakened wood. Strong winds stretched ropes. Even a small crack could become dangerous during the next crossing. Every repair increased the crew's chances of returning safely to Greenland when the time eventually came. The ships rested quietly on the shoreline, like patient companions. Without them, every person understood they would remain trapped on an unfamiliar continent. Beyond the village, the surrounding landscape offered remarkable abundance. Dense forests covered hillsides unlike anything found in Greenland. Streams flowed with remarkably clear water. Wild berries appeared during the warmer months. Birds nested along rocky cliffs. The forests sheltered animals unfamiliar to some of the settlers. Each expedition into the wilderness revealed something new. Yet exploration always demanded caution. The Norse travelers realized they were guests in an enormous landscape they barely understood. Even weather behaved differently. Fog sometimes rolled inland without warning. Strong winds shifted rapidly along the coast. The sea that appeared calm in the morning could become dangerous by afternoon. Experience slowly taught the settlers which signs to trust. The flight of seabirds, the shape of distant clouds, the changing color of the horizon. Nature spoke constantly to those willing to observe. As summer continued, daylight seemed endless. Far north, the sun lingered well into the evening. Work often continued late beneath soft golden light. There was no urgency to rush indoors before darkness. Instead, the settlement remained active until fatigue finally encouraged everyone to rest. Those long evenings created opportunities for conversation. People shared stories while repairing fishing nets. Children listened quietly. Older settlers remembered Greenland. Some perhaps remembered Iceland. A few may have even recalled Norway from childhood. Their memories stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Although they had traveled farther west than nearly anyone in Europe, home still remained somewhere beyond the eastern horizon. Isolation slowly shaped daily life. Weeks passed without seeing another ship. No messenger arrived. No new fresh news crossed the Atlantic. The little settlement depended entirely upon itself. Every success belonged to everyone. Every mistake affected the whole community. Trust became as important as food. Still, not every mystery came from nature. Occasionally, small discoveries hinted that other people moved through these forests. A footprint near a stream, freshly broken branches, the remains of an old campfire, perhaps an arrow shaft unlike those carried by the Norse. Nothing suggested immediate danger, only quiet evidence that this land had never been empty. Today we know that indigenous peoples had lived across North America for thousands of years before the Vikings arrived. Different cultures occupied different regions, each with rich traditions, languages, and knowledge of the land. The North settlers almost certainly realized they were not alone, even if those first signs remained distant and uncertain. Curiosity likely mixed with caution. Who were these people? Would they be friendly? Could trade become possible? Or would both sides simply watch one another from afar? No one could yet know. As evening settled over the settlement once more, the day's work gradually came to an end. Fishing boats returned with fresh catches. Hunters emerged from the forest. Children carried small bundles of firewood toward the houses. Warm light flickered through the narrow doorways of the turf homes. The smell of cooking drifted gently across the quiet village. Far beyond the shoreline, waves continued their endless journey across the Atlantic, the same ocean that had carried them here and the same ocean that still separated them from everything they once called home. For now, life felt peaceful. The houses stood strong, the fires burned warmly, the forests provided generously. Yet somewhere beyond the trees, unseen neighbors quietly observed the newcomers, just as the newcomers quietly wondered about them. Neither side could imagine how important those first encounters would soon become. The village woke to another calm northern morning. A soft layer of mist floated above the bay, hiding the horizon where the sea met the sky. The waves rolled gently onto the rocky shore with the same quiet rhythm they had repeated long before the Norse settlers arrived and long after they would eventually leave. Life within the settlement had settled into a comforting routine. The houses stood firmly beneath their thick layers of turf. Wood smoke drifted slowly into the cool air. Fishing nets hung drying outside, moving gently whenever the breeze passed through. The sounds of ordinary work filled the village. Axes struck timber. Children laughed as they carried small bundles of firewood. A blacksmith's hammer rang steadily from the workshop. Nothing suggested that history was quietly unfolding here. To the settlers, this was simply another day. Yet beyond the familiar footpaths surrounding the village, another story was also taking place. The forests, rivers, and coastlines of this land had never been empty. Long before Viking ships appeared on the Atlantic horizon, indigenous peoples had lived throughout these northern regions for countless generations. They understood the changing seasons. They knew where fish gathered during different months. They recognized animal trails invisible to newcomers. The forests were not mysterious to them. They were home. Modern archaeologists and historians believe the Norse settlers almost certainly encountered indigenous peoples during their time in North America. Exactly which communities they met remains uncertain, and many details have been lost over the centuries. The Icelandic sagas describe people they called the Skrælings, a Norse term whose precise meaning is still debated today. While the sagas provide valuable clues, historians approach them carefully, comparing their stories with archaeological evidence whenever possible. This careful approach reminds us that history often survives only in fragments. One quiet afternoon, several Norse explorers may have followed a nearby river farther inland than before. They walked slowly beneath tall trees, listening to birdsong echo through the forest. The sunlight filtered gently through the branches, creating shifting patterns across the ground. Everything felt unfamiliar. Different plants, different birds, different sounds. Even experienced hunters understood that caution mattered in an unknown landscape. As they reached an open clearing, they noticed something unusual. Not animals, not danger. Simply signs of human activity. Fresh footprints pressed into soft earth. Branches that had been neatly cut. The remains of a small cooking fire, long since cooled. Someone had been here recently. The Norse explorers paused. No words were needed. Every member of the group understood what these quiet clues meant. Other people lived nearby. Perhaps they had already been watching the settlement from a distance. Perhaps they had seen the strange ships arriving weeks earlier. Perhaps they had wondered about these newcomers just as much as the newcomers wondered about them. The Norse explorers returned to the village before sunset. Around the evening fire, they likely shared what they had discovered. No panic spread through the settlement. Only thoughtful conversation. Some believed peaceful trade might be possible. Others suggested greater caution. No one truly knew what the future would bring. Over the following days, the signs became more frequent. A distant figure standing briefly on a hillside before disappearing into the trees. Fresh canoe tracks along a quiet stream. Smoke rising far beyond the forest. Neither group rushed toward the other. Instead, both observed carefully. This quiet period of mutual curiosity may have lasted longer than we can ever know. For the indigenous communities, the arrival of the Norse must have been remarkable. Large wooden ships, unlike anything they had seen, rested along the shoreline. Foreign languages carried across the wind. Iron tools reflected sunlight. Livestock grazed near unfamiliar buildings covered in grass. Everything about these visitors appeared different. At the same time, the Norse settlers found themselves surrounded by people whose knowledge of the land far exceeded their own. The newcomers possessed iron. The local communities possessed generations of experience. Both groups had something the other did not. History tells us that first meetings between different cultures can follow many paths. Some begin with fear. Others begin with trade. Many include both. The Icelandic sagas suggest that periods of peaceful exchange may have occurred before relationships eventually became more complicated. Although the exact details remain uncertain, historians believe it is entirely possible that goods were exchanged during at least some encounters. Perhaps animal furs changed hands. Perhaps food. Perhaps simple crafted objects. Iron itself would have been an extraordinary material to people who had never worked with it in the same way. Likewise, the Norse settlers valued local knowledge that could never be carried across an ocean. Were salmon gathered? When seals appeared? Which plants could safely be eaten? Which rivers remained navigable? Every conversation, even one shared through gestures rather than words, had the potential to teach both sides something valuable. Communication was almost certainly difficult. Neither side understood the other's language. Simple gestures became important. Open hands. Slow movements. Careful observation. Expressions carried meaning when words could not. Human beings have relied upon such silent communication for thousands of years. Sometimes it succeeds remarkably well. Sometimes misunderstanding quietly grows beneath the surface. Back in the settlement, daily life continued. Fishing boats still left before sunrise. The blacksmith still repaired broken tools. Children still played between the houses. Yet everyone remained a little more aware of the forest surrounding them. Those woods no longer felt empty. Instead, they seemed filled with unseen neighbors living lives just beyond sight. Curiosity slowly replaced some of the mystery. The settlers realized they were not discovering an untouched wilderness. They had arrived in someone else's homeland. That understanding carried quiet importance. Modern history often reminds us that exploration looks different depending on whose story is being told. For the Norse, this was a distant frontier. For indigenous peoples, it was already home. Both truths existed at the same time.
As summer slowly drifted toward autumn, the weather began changing almost unnoticed. The evenings grew cooler. Morning frost occasionally touched the grass. Migrating birds gathered in larger numbers overhead. Nature offered its usual reminders that another northern winter would eventually arrive. The settlers increased their preparations. Firewood piles grew taller. Fish were dried and stored. Meat was carefully preserved. Every successful community understood that winter planning began long before the first snowfall. Meanwhile, the forests remained quiet. Occasional distant figures appeared and disappeared among the trees. Smoke sometimes rose beyond the hills. Life continued for both cultures, sometimes separated by only a few miles, yet divided by language, tradition, and entirely different ways of understanding the world. Neither could see far into the future.
Autumn arrived so gently that few people noticed the exact day the season had changed. The mornings became cooler. A thin layer of frost occasionally covered the grass before the rising sun slowly melted it away. The forests that had welcomed the settlers with endless shades of green now displayed deep reds, bright golds, and warm orange leaves that drifted quietly toward the forest floor. The little Norse settlement continued its steady rhythm. Smoke rose from every turf house before sunrise. Fishing boats slipped silently into the calm bay. Axes echoed through the woods as more firewood was gathered for the long months ahead. Every day followed familiar patterns. Every task served a purpose. Winter was never far from the minds of people who lived so close to the northern edge of the world. By now, the settlers had accepted an important truth. They were not alone. From time to time, distant figures appeared along the shoreline or at the edge of the forest. Sometimes they remained only for a few moments before disappearing once again among the trees. Neither side hurried toward the other. Both watched with quiet curiosity. For the Norse, these brief sightings gradually became part of ordinary life. The unfamiliar no longer felt entirely surprising. Instead, it invited careful observation. The Icelandic sagas describe several encounters between the Norse explorers and the indigenous peoples of this region. While historians cannot verify every detail recorded in those medieval stories, archaeological evidence strongly supports the idea that contact almost certainly occurred. Exactly how those first meetings unfolded remains one of history's unanswered questions. Perhaps one calm afternoon, a small group approached across the shoreline. No weapons were raised, no loud voices disturbed the silence. Instead, both groups stopped a respectful distance apart. The ocean breeze carried unfamiliar words in two completely different languages. Neither side understood the other, yet human beings have communicated without shared language throughout history. A smile, an open hand, a careful nod, even the simple act of remaining still can express peaceful intentions. The Norse may have offered pieces of bright-colored cloth, small iron objects, simple wooden tools. In return, local hunters might have presented valuable animal furs or carefully prepared food gathered from the surrounding land. Such exchanges required patience. Every movement mattered. Every gesture was observed closely. Trust cannot appear instantly. It grows slowly, often through repeated acts of kindness that seem almost ordinary at the time. For a while, peaceful meetings may have continued. Both communities had much to learn from one another. The Norse admired the remarkable knowledge indigenous hunters possessed. They seemed to move through forests with quiet confidence, recognizing trails invisible to newcomers. They understood where animals traveled during different seasons. They knew which rivers filled with fish at certain times of year. Generations of experience had shaped that knowledge. The Norse settlers, meanwhile, possessed skills unfamiliar to the local communities. Their iron tools remained especially impressive. An iron knife stayed sharper longer than stone. A sturdy axe could fell large trees more efficiently. Even simple nails represented valuable craftsmanship. Each side carried knowledge developed over countless generations in different parts of the world. For a brief period, those differences may have encouraged cooperation rather than conflict. Back in the village, life continued much as before. Women preserved fish by drying it in the cool autumn air. Meat from successful hunts was carefully smoked above slow-burning fires. Wooden barrels filled with supplies lined the inside walls of storage buildings. Children gathered berries before the first hard frost ended the season. The blacksmith remained busy repairing tools worn down by months of steady work. Preparation became almost constant. Northern winters rewarded planning. They rarely forgave carelessness. Evenings arrived earlier now. The long summer daylight gradually disappeared. Families spent more hours indoors, gathered around warm fires. Stories filled the darkness. Some tales spoke of distant Norway. Others remembered Greenland. Children listened while shadows danced softly across the turf walls. Outside, the wind carried fallen leaves across empty paths connecting the houses. The village felt peaceful, yet beneath that peaceful routine, uncertainty quietly remained. No one fully understood the intentions of their distant neighbors. Likewise, indigenous communities probably wondered about these foreign visitors whose large ships rested beside the bay. Would they remain? Would more ships arrive? Would they eventually leave? No one possessed those answers. History often changes not because people desire conflict, but because uncertainty slowly grows into fear. Small misunderstandings can become larger than anyone expects. Imagine two groups meeting without shared language. A gesture intended as friendship might appear threatening. A warning might sound like an insult. A misunderstanding over valuable resources could quickly create tension where none previously existed. Historians believe such misunderstandings likely played an important role in later encounters. The Icelandic sagas describe periods when peaceful exchange eventually gave way to violence. Although the details cannot always be confirmed, most historians agree that relations probably became increasingly difficult over time. Neither side fully understood the other's customs. Both wished to protect their families. Both viewed the unfamiliar with growing caution. As autumn deepened, another challenge emerged. Resources that seemed plentiful during summer no longer appeared endless. Fish migrated. Certain animals became harder to find. Storms occasionally kept boats ashore for days at a time. Preparing enough food for winter demanded enormous effort. The North settlement remained small. Every person mattered. Every day's success contributed directly to everyone's survival. One poor season could threaten the entire community. The forests, once welcoming and mysterious, now felt larger than ever. Their shadows lengthened with each passing week. Cold rain replaced warm sunshine more often. The settlers worked from dawn till dusk, gathering every possible resource before winter claimed the landscape. At times, someone standing near the shoreline might have noticed distant smoke rising once again beyond the hills. Perhaps another community prepared for winter in exactly the same way. Different people, different traditions, the same approaching cold, the same need to care for family, the same hope that enough food had been stored before snow covered the land. There is something quietly human about that shared experience. Across cultures separated by language and oceans, ordinary people often worried about remarkably similar things. Would the children remain healthy? Would the weather remain kind? Would supplies last until spring? History remembers explorers and leaders by name. It rarely records the quiet concerns carried by ordinary mothers, fathers, grandparents, and children. Yet those concerns shaped daily life far more than famous events ever could. One evening, as darkness settled earlier than it had only weeks before, the settlers gathered around their fires once again. Outside, the first strong wind of the coming season swept across the bay. The sea answered with deeper waves striking the rocky shore. The sound echoed through the growing darkness. Inside, conversation became quieter. The village had survived another season. The houses stood firm. Food stores continued to grow. The ships remained safely pulled onto land. Everything appeared secure. And yet, somewhere beyond the edge of the firelight, change was already beginning. The coming winter would test every skill the settlers possessed. It would also test the fragile relationship that had slowly formed between the newcomers and the people who had called this land home for countless generations. The peaceful days of easy curiosity were slowly giving way to more difficult questions, questions that neither side could answer with certainty. In the next part, we will quietly follow the settlement into its first northern winter, where isolation, harsh weather, and growing uncertainty began to reshape life at the edge of the Viking world.
Winter did not arrive all at once. It announced itself quietly. The mornings grew darker. The wind carried a sharper edge across the bay. The last colorful leaves disappeared from the trees, leaving bare branches that swayed gently beneath gray skies. The sea, once calm for many days at a time, became less predictable, and each passing week reminded the settlers that nature always set the rules in this distant land. By now, nearly every family had finished preparing for the cold season. Stacks of firewood stood beside every turf house. Bundles of dried fish hung safely inside storage buildings. Smoked meat had been carefully preserved. Tools had been repaired. Roofs had been strengthened with fresh layers of turf. The little settlement looked ready. Whether it truly was, only the coming months would decide. Inside the homes, daily life changed with the season. During summer, much of the work took place outdoors. Now, families spent longer hours gathered around the central fire. The warmth was welcome, but the space remained modest. Smoke slowly drifted upward toward the opening in the roof, though some always lingered inside. The smell of burning wood became part of everyday life. Light came mostly from the fire itself, and from small oil lamps that flickered softly against the wooden walls. Outside, daylight grew shorter. Each morning seemed to arrive later than the last. Each afternoon faded more quickly into evening. For people living so far north, this rhythm was familiar. Darkness was not something to fear. It was simply another season to accept. The long evenings were rarely wasted. Women repaired worn clothing before it became too damaged to save. Wool was spun into thread. Leather boots were patched with careful skill. Fishing nets were mended one careful knot at a time. The blacksmith continued working whenever enough charcoal remained, reshaping broken tools that would be needed again when spring returned. Children also adapted to winter life. They helped carry firewood into the houses before snowfall covered the ground. They cared for livestock kept close to the settlement. They listened carefully as older family members explained which supplies could be used freely and which needed to last until warmer weather. Winter taught patience. It also taught discipline. Every family understood that waste could carry serious consequences. The village itself became quieter. Instead of scattered voices across open fields, conversation remained close to the fires. The sounds of axes and boat repairs faded.
In their place came quieter rhythms, the crackling of burning wood, the scraping of carving knives shaping wooden bowls or tool handles, the gentle turning of spinning wheels, the occasional laughter that reminded everyone that comfort could still be found even during difficult seasons. Beyond the village, however, the world became far less welcoming. Strong winds swept across the coastline without warning. Snow sometimes fell for hours before stopping as suddenly as it had begun. Ice formed along sheltered streams. Travel through the forests became slower and more demanding. Hunters needed greater skill to follow animal tracks hidden beneath fresh snow. Fishing also became more difficult. Storms often forced boats to remain on shore. The sea that had once provided generous harvests could now become dangerous in only a matter of minutes. The settlers accepted these challenges because they had known harsh winters before. Greenland had taught them endurance, but this land was still unfamiliar. They understood only part of its seasonal patterns. Every winter carried lessons they could not have learned anywhere else. Sometimes, during calmer days, small hunting groups ventured into the surrounding forests. The snow revealed countless animal tracks: foxes, caribou, hares, birds searching for food. The wilderness remained full of life, even when everything appeared silent. Experienced hunters learned to read these signs almost like words written across the landscape. A broken branch, fresh prints, tiny feathers scattered across the snow. Nature constantly revealed its stories to those who observed carefully. Occasionally, other tracks appeared as well. Human footprints, not Norse boots, smaller, different. Sometimes leading toward the hills, sometimes disappearing into thick forests. The settlers rarely followed them. There was no need. By now, everyone knew that other communities continued living nearby throughout the winter. Those people understood this land far better than any newcomer ever could. Perhaps they too noticed Norse footprints from time to time. Perhaps they wondered whether the strangers would remain until spring. History offers no certain answers, only possibilities. Inside the settlement, conversation increasingly turned toward Greenland. Would the sea open early enough for ships to return? Would another expedition arrive next summer? Had everything remained peaceful back home? No one knew. The Atlantic Ocean, which had once carried them westward, now stood between them and every familiar place they remembered. Isolation slowly became one of winter's greatest challenges. Not hunger, not cold, loneliness. Months could pass without seeing another Norse ship, without hearing news from distant settlements, without knowing whether loved ones across the ocean remained healthy. The little village depended almost entirely upon itself. That realization grew heavier with each passing storm. Still, moments of beauty remained. After heavy snowfall, the world became astonishingly quiet. The forests stood motionless beneath blankets of white. The frozen shoreline reflected pale winter sunlight. On clear nights, countless stars stretched across the sky with remarkable brightness. Far from modern cities, darkness allowed the heavens to appear almost endless. Some evenings, curtains of green and pale white light, the aurora, drifted silently across the northern sky. The Norse had seen these lights before in Greenland and Iceland, but they never became ordinary. They shimmered slowly above the frozen landscape, beautiful without needing explanation. Today, we understand them as natural displays created by charged particles from the sun interacting with Earth's atmosphere. To the settlers, they were simply another unforgettable feature of the northern world. As winter deepened, the village settled into a steady routine of endurance. Supplies were carefully measured. Animals were watched closely. Firewood disappeared faster than anyone wished. Yet the houses remained warm. The people remained together. For now, that was enough.
Then one afternoon, after several days of heavy snow, a lookout standing near the shoreline noticed something unusual. Far across the white landscape, barely visible between the trees, several distant figures moved quietly along the edge of the forest. They did not approach, they simply paused for a few moments, watching the settlement from afar, before disappearing once again into the winter woods. No voices were exchanged, no weapons were raised. Only silence remained. Back inside the village, the sight became another topic of quiet discussion around the evening fires. Some believed the visitors were simply hunting. Others wondered if they were observing the strangers who had crossed the ocean. No one could say with certainty. Yet everyone sensed that the long season of cautious distance could not continue forever. Sooner or later, another meeting would come. Whether it would strengthen peace or deepen mistrust remained impossible to know. Outside, snow continued falling gently onto the roofs of the little north village. The world seemed calm. The fires still burned. The families still hoped. But beneath the quiet beauty of the northern winter, the future remained as uncertain as the frozen sea beyond the bay. In the next part, we will quietly follow the return of spring. When the ice begins to melt, the sea awakens once again, and the settlers face choices that will slowly determine the fate of their remarkable village.
Winter did not end in a single day. Its grip slowly loosened, almost too gently to notice. The first signs appeared not in the forests, but along the shoreline. Small patches of dark water began opening between the sheets of ice. The wind felt slightly softer than it had only a few weeks before. Birds returned one by one, their familiar calls breaking the long silence that had settled over the settlement during the coldest months. For the families living in the little Norse village, these quiet changes brought cautious hope. Another winter had been survived. The stores of dried fish and smoked meat had lasted just long enough. The fires had continued to burn. The turf houses had protected their families from the harsh northern winds. No one celebrated loudly. People who lived close to nature understood that spring itself demanded patience. One warm afternoon did not mean winter had truly ended. Instead, they waited. They watched. They allowed the land to reveal its intentions one day at a time. As the snow slowly disappeared, familiar paths emerged once again between the houses. Children who had spent so many months indoors eagerly ran across the damp grass. Their laughter filled the village, sounding brighter after the long season of quiet evenings. Adults quickly returned to work. There was much to do before another summer arrived. Fishing boats that had rested on shore throughout the winter were carefully inspected. Some required only minor repairs. Others showed cracks that had appeared after months of freezing temperatures. Every plank had to be examined, every rope checked, every sail unfolded and repaired where winter storms had left their mark. The longships remained the settlement's greatest treasure. Without them, the settlers had no reliable way to return to Greenland or continue exploring the coastline. Nearby, the blacksmith once again became one of the busiest people in the village. Axes dulled by months of chopping firewood needed sharpening. Fishing hooks required repair. Nails had to be forged for buildings weakened by the heavy snow. The small forge glowed brightly, its familiar rhythm returning to daily life. The steady sound of hammer striking iron echoed across the settlement, just as it had before winter arrived. Out in the forests, another transformation was taking place. The frozen ground softened beneath the warming sun. Small streams carried melting snow toward the sea. Fresh green plants slowly pushed through the damp earth. Animals that had remained hidden throughout the cold months became easier to find. Hunters once again followed tracks through the woods. grateful for the opportunity to gather fresh meat after relying so heavily on stored food. Fishing also improved. As the waters warmed, fish returned to the nearby rivers and coastal shallows. The settlers repaired their nets with great care before launching small boats into the calm bay. Every successful catch meant healthier families and fuller storage houses for the months ahead. The sea, which had seemed so harsh during winter, once again became generous. Yet spring also revealed something else. As the snow melted across the surrounding landscape, fresh footprints appeared more often. Not animal tracks, human ones. The settlers noticed signs that nearby indigenous communities had also become more active after the winter. Fresh campfires, recently cut branches, canoe marks along muddy riverbanks. These quiet discoveries reminded everyone that they continued to share this land with others. One clear morning, while gathering timber deeper in the forest, a small Norse work party stopped without speaking. Ahead, between the trees, several indigenous hunters had also paused. For a few long moments, neither group moved. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, one of the hunters lowered the bundle he carried. A Norse woodcutter placed his axe against the fallen log instead of holding it. No words could bridge the distance between their languages, but neither side wished to begin the day with fear. The two groups remained separated by only a short distance. Curiosity was visible on every face. The clothing differed, the tools differed. Even the way each group moved through the forest reflected generations of different experience. After a quiet pause, the indigenous hunters continued on their way. The Norse workers returned to their timber. No trade occurred, no conflict followed. Only another peaceful meeting added to the growing memory both communities carried of one another. Back in the village, life continued with renewed energy. Women gathered edible plants that had begun growing once more. Children collected bird eggs from nearby cliffs whenever it could be done safely. Fresh water flowed strongly through the streams, making every journey easier than it had been during the frozen months. There was a feeling that the settlement had passed an important test. Perhaps they truly belonged here. Perhaps another successful year lay ahead. Such thoughts must have felt comforting. But history often reminds us that confidence can arrive just before circumstances begin to change. As the weeks passed, several experienced sailors began discussing something that quietly concerned them. No ship had yet appeared from Greenland. By this point in the season, they had expected to see familiar sails somewhere beyond the horizon. Storms sometimes delayed voyages. That was nothing unusual. The North Atlantic rarely followed anyone's schedule. Still, each passing week without news made the silence feel a little heavier. Every evening, someone naturally glanced toward the open sea. Nothing. Only waves. Only seabirds. Only the endless horizon stretching eastward toward the lands they had once called home. The settlement still possessed enough supplies. No immediate danger threatened the village. Yet uncertainty has a way of growing quietly. Questions began replacing answers. Had severe storms damaged ships in Greenland? Had poor harvests prevented anyone from sailing? Or had something happened that no one here could possibly know? Without regular communication, even ordinary delays became mysterious. The Atlantic Ocean had always connected the Norse world. Now, for the first time, it also felt like a barrier. Meanwhile, the surrounding forests remained full of life. Flowers bloomed beneath tall trees. The air carried the scent of damp earth and pine. Birdsong echoed from sunrise until evening. Nature seemed completely unconcerned with the worries of the small human settlement beside the bay. One evening, as the sun settled low over the western horizon, an elderly settler stood quietly near the shoreline. Perhaps he remembered Greenland. Perhaps he thought about Norway, a place many younger villagers had never seen. Perhaps he simply listened to the waves.
Nearby, children played among the boats, unaware of the concerns shared by the adults. For them, this distant coast had become home. They knew its forests, its rivers, its rocky beaches. They did not remember another life. The adults, however, understood how fragile their future remained. Everything depended upon the sea. Everything depended upon the next ship. Everything depended upon whether this lonely settlement could remain connected to the rest of the Norse world. As darkness slowly covered the bay, no sail appeared on the horizon. Only the gentle sound of waves reached the quiet village. The settlers returned to their homes, carrying both hope and uncertainty into another peaceful night. None of them could know that the silence stretching across the Atlantic would soon become one of the greatest challenges their community had ever faced. In the next part, we will quietly explore how the absence of supply ships, growing isolation, and difficult decisions slowly began to change the future of the Viking settlement, leading it towards a fate that history still cannot fully explain.
The sea remained empty. Each morning, someone naturally looked toward the eastern horizon before beginning the day's work. It had become an unspoken habit throughout the settlement. No one was officially assigned to watch for ships, yet everyone did. The answer was always the same: only the endless Atlantic, only distant waves rolling beneath a pale northern sky. As another week passed without a sail appearing, the silence began to feel heavier than anyone wished to admit. Life itself continued. Fishing boats still left the shore before sunrise. Hunters disappeared into the forests. Children chased one another between the turf houses, laughing as though nothing had changed. On the surface, the village looked peaceful, but beneath that calm routine, quiet questions slowly settled into every household. Why had no ship arrived from Greenland? The settlers understood that voyages across the North Atlantic were never guaranteed. Storms could delay travelers for weeks. Heavy ice sometimes blocked familiar routes. Ships occasionally returned home later than expected. These possibilities were ordinary. Still, experienced sailors knew that every passing day made the delay a little harder to explain. One evening, several of the older men gathered near the shoreline after repairing one of the longships. The conversation was calm. No voices were raised. They discussed the weather, the condition of the sea, and the direction of recent winds. Perhaps a late storm had damaged vessels back in Greenland. Perhaps another settlement needed help before anyone could sail west. Perhaps this year's expedition had simply been postponed. Each explanation sounded reasonable, yet none could be confirmed. The ocean kept its answers to itself. Back in the village, daily life slowly adapted to the uncertainty. Food stores were examined more carefully than before, not because supplies were dangerously low, they were not, but because no one could predict how long they might need to last. Fish continued to provide reliable meals. Fresh water flowed freely from nearby streams. The surrounding forests still offered game for skilled hunters. The settlement remained capable of supporting itself. Even so, every community depends upon more than food alone. Iron tools eventually wear out. Ropes fray. Sails become thin after years of wind and salt. Some materials simply could not be replaced easily in this distant land. The blacksmith noticed these challenges first. Every repair now demanded greater care. Broken nails were straightened and used again. Small fragments of iron were never discarded. A damaged knife might be reshaped into a smaller tool rather than replaced entirely. Nothing valuable went to waste. This careful way of living was familiar to the Norse. They had practiced it for generations. But now, necessity made every decision even more important. As summer turned fully into spring, the forests became alive once again. Tall grasses covered the open fields. Wildflowers colored the edges of streams. Birdsong echoed from dawn until evening. The beauty surrounding the settlement seemed almost endless. Yet nature also reminded the settlers that seasons never remain still. Every warm day quietly carried them closer to another autumn. The people understood this better than anyone. Summer was not simply a pleasant season, it was the time to prepare for everything that followed. Fishing intensified. Large catches were cleaned, salted, and dried beneath the gentle northern sun. Hunters traveled farther inland in search of caribou and other game. Women gathered berries, medicinal plants, and edible roots known to be safe. Woodcutters increased their work, preparing another year's supply of firewood while conditions remained favorable. Every successful day strengthened the settlement. Meanwhile, contact with the nearby indigenous communities remained cautious. Occasionally, distant figures could still be seen across the water or moving quietly between the trees. Sometimes signs of recent camps appeared near rivers. Sometimes footprints crossed muddy trails after fresh rain. The Norse no longer reacted with surprise. These quiet reminders had become part of life. Both peoples continued to share the same landscape while respecting an invisible distance. Historians believe that such periods of cautious coexistence were entirely possible. Not every encounter between different cultures ended in immediate conflict. Many likely consisted of little more than observation, quiet curiosity, and careful avoidance. The archaeological record often preserves only objects. It rarely captures moments of simple peace. One afternoon, a group of Norse fishermen returned with unusually large catches. The entire village gathered to help prepare the fish before sunset. Children carried baskets, women cleaned and salted the meat, men built additional drying racks from freshly cut timber. Laughter drifted across the settlement. For a little while, worries about distant Greenland faded. The simple satisfaction of shared work filled the evening. Moments like these often disappear from history. No chronicler records them, no saga celebrates them, yet they formed the true foundation of everyday life. History is not built only from great discoveries and famous battles. It is also built from ordinary evenings spent beside neighbors, preparing food for another winter. As the days continued, however, one concern became increasingly difficult to ignore. Several experienced sailors calculated the remaining time before autumn storms would once again make Atlantic crossings dangerous. If no ship arrived soon, another year might pass before regular contact with Greenland became possible. The realization spread quietly through the settlement. No announcement was necessary. Everyone understood. If they wished to leave before winter, they might have to rely entirely on their own vessels. If they remained, another long season of isolation awaited. Some families probably favored staying. The village had survived. Food remains plentiful. The land continued providing what they needed. Others may have argued that returning to Greenland offered greater security. There, larger communities existed. Trade remained possible. Relatives waited. Neither choice was simple. Both carried risks. The village stood at a crossroads, though no one yet realized how important those decisions would become. Far beyond the settlement, the Atlantic continued its endless rhythm. Waves crossed thousands of miles without pause. Somewhere across that immense ocean, Greenland still waited. Whether ships would ever appear again remained impossible to know. One evening, after the day's work had ended, a young child asked an older sailor a simple question. "When will the next ship come?" The old man looked toward the empty horizon before answering. "We'll know when we see it sail." It was a gentle reply, kind, hopeful. Yet everyone nearby understood the deeper truth. Sometimes the sea gives clear answers. Sometimes it gives only silence. As darkness settled over the little Viking village once again, the fires inside the turf houses burned warmly. Outside, the wind moved softly through the grass. The settlement remained peaceful, strong, resourceful. But for the first time since arriving on these distant shores, the future no longer seemed as certain as it once had. Some villages disappear because of sudden disaster. Others fade through a series of quiet decisions, each one reasonable on its own.
until one day the houses stand empty. The people living here had not reached that moment, not yet, but history was already beginning to move in that direction. In the next part, we will gently follow the difficult choices facing the settlers as some families begin to consider leaving this distant shore, while others still believe the village can survive another year at the edge of the Viking world.
Summer slowly reached its fullest days. The sun lingered high above the northern horizon, filling the long evenings with gentle golden light. Wildflowers covered the open meadows surrounding the settlement, and the forests echoed with the songs of countless birds. From a distance, the little Norse village appeared peaceful, almost timeless, as though it had always belonged beside the quiet bay. Yet, appearances can be wonderfully misleading. Inside nearly every turf house, quiet conversations had begun to change. The question was no longer whether the settlement could survive another winter. It almost certainly could. The more difficult question had become whether it should. For more than a year, no ship had arrived from Greenland. No familiar faces had appeared on the horizon. No news had crossed the Atlantic. The settlers had learned to depend almost entirely upon themselves. That independence brought pride. It also brought uncertainty. One evening, after the day's work had ended, several families gathered around a large cooking fire outside one of the houses. Fresh fish roasted slowly above glowing coals. Children chased one another across the grass while the adults spoke quietly. The discussion was calm. No one argued. Everyone respected the weight of the decision before them. Some believed the settlement had already proven its strength. The forests offered timber beyond anything Greenland could provide. The rivers remained rich with fish. The surrounding coastline continued supplying seals and seabirds. If another winter could be survived once, perhaps many more could follow. Others viewed the future differently. They worried about isolation. Iron supplies slowly decreased. Every repaired tool represented one less piece of metal that could someday be reshaped. Clothing would eventually wear beyond repair. Livestock might suffer during unusually harsh winters. Without regular contact with Greenland, every passing year increased the risks. Neither side was entirely right. Neither side was entirely wrong. Such choices rarely offer perfect answers. History often remembers only the final outcome. It seldom remembers how difficult the decision itself truly was. As these conversations continued, life in the settlement carried on much as before. Hunters returned from the forests with fresh game. The blacksmith repaired damaged tools. Children learned new skills by watching their parents work. Women continued preserving food for the coming seasons. Routine remained one of the village's greatest strengths. Every familiar task reminded the settlers that they still possessed the knowledge needed to survive. One bright afternoon, a group of sailors carefully examined their largest longship. The vessel had weathered countless miles across the North Atlantic. Its sturdy oak planks still held together remarkably well. Even so, years of salt water, storms, and repairs had left their mark. Each crack required careful attention. Each worn rope demanded replacement. The vessel represented something more than transportation. It represented possibility. If the community chose to return east, this vessel would carry their hopes across one of the world's most demanding oceans. Nearby, several younger settlers listened as older sailors described earlier voyages between Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and this distant western land. They spoke not with excitement, but with experience. They described shifting winds, unexpected fog, floating ice, storms that appeared without warning. The Atlantic had always rewarded skill while showing little mercy towards carelessness. No one underestimated the journey home. Across the bay, another quiet reminder of the surrounding world appeared. Several indigenous hunters paddled slender canoes along the distant shoreline. They remained far away. The Norse watched silently. The hunters continued their journey without approaching the village. For a few moments, two very different communities simply shared the same peaceful afternoon. Then the canoes disappeared around a rocky point. Moments like these likely occurred more often than history can record. Not every meeting became an event. Sometimes people simply observed one another from afar before continuing their ordinary lives. The archaeological record cannot preserve such quiet moments, yet they may have been among the most common experiences shared between the Norse settlers and the indigenous peoples of the region. As August slowly approached, nature itself offered another gentle reminder. The evenings became slightly cooler. Migrating birds began to gather in larger flocks. The first berries reached full ripeness. Every sign suggested that summer's greatest warmth would not last forever. Experienced settlers recognized these changes immediately. Preparation for another winter quietly began once again. Firewood piles grew taller. Fishing intensified. Food storage buildings gradually filled. At the same time, several families started organizing their personal belongings more carefully than before. Tools were sorted, clothing was inspected, wooden chests were repaired. No one openly announced plans to leave. Still, the careful packing of valuable possessions did not go unnoticed. Children sensed the change before fully understanding it. They overheard fragments of conversations, questions about Greenland, questions about ships, questions about whether friends might remain behind. For them, this village was home. Some had spent so much of their young lives here that the rocky shoreline, quiet forests, and long northern evenings felt completely familiar. The idea of leaving seemed almost unimaginable. Adults carried a different burden. They remembered other homes, other settlements, relatives waiting somewhere beyond the Atlantic. They understood that choosing between two homes often meant losing one of them. One calm evening, an elderly woman walked slowly beyond the last house and sat overlooking the bay. The sea stretched endlessly before her. Perhaps she remembered the first day the ships had arrived, the excitement, the uncertainty, the promise of beginning again in a new land. Now, after seasons of hard work, the settlement had become something real. Children had grown, buildings had weathered storms, paths had formed naturally beneath countless footsteps. This place held memories. Leaving would not erase them, yet staying might demand sacrifices no one could fully measure. As the sun settled low over the western horizon, its golden light reflected across the quiet water. The village looked peaceful, strong, alive. No visitor arriving by sea could have guessed that its future had already begun to shift. History sometimes imagines abandoned places as scenes of sudden tragedy. In reality, many communities disappear much more gently. A family leaves first, another follows the next season. A building stands empty. A workshop grows silent. One day, without any single dramatic moment, the village is simply no longer there. The settlers could not yet see that future. They still laughed together, worked together, shared meals beside warm fires. But the first quiet thoughts of departure had already entered their lives. And once such thoughts appear, they are rarely easy to forget. As darkness slowly settled over the little Norse settlement, waves continued their endless rhythm against the shore. The ocean waited patiently. Whether it would soon carry these people home or leave them here for another year remained one of the greatest unanswered questions of their lives. Autumn returned with familiar certainty. The air became cooler with each passing morning, and a soft mist once again settled over the quiet bay before the sun slowly lifted it away. The forests surrounding the settlement, so full of green only weeks earlier, began changing into warm shades of gold, amber, and deep red. The seasons had completed another cycle. For the people living in the little Norse village, that simple fact carried great meaning. They had crossed the Atlantic, built homes from timber and turf, survived an unfamiliar winter, learned the rhythms of a distant coastline. Now they stood at another turning point. This autumn felt different, not because the weather had changed, because the people had. The discussions that had once taken place quietly around evening fires were now becoming decisions. Some families believed it was time to return to Greenland while the sea still allowed safe passage. Others wished to remain a little longer, convinced that another successful year was possible. No single leader could make that choice for everyone. Each family weighed its own hopes against its own fears. The settlement had never been large. Every departure would be noticed. One crisp morning, several settlers carried supplies toward the largest longship resting on the shore. They worked without urgency. Wooden chests were carefully loaded. Bundles of dried fish were stacked below the deck. Fresh water was poured into sturdy barrels. Coils of rope were inspected one final time. No one spoke very loudly. The mood was thoughtful rather than emotional. Preparing a ship for an Atlantic crossing demanded complete attention. There was little room for distraction. Nearby, children watched with curious eyes. Some asked whether they would soon see Greenland. Others wondered if they would return to this place one day. Few adults offered certain answers. The ocean rarely rewarded certainty. Back in the village, life continued for those who had chosen to remain. Fishing nets still needed repairing. Firewood still had to be gathered. Livestock still required daily care. Even if part of the community departed, the settlement itself would continue, at least for now. Yet, subtle changes had already begun. One house stood empty after its family packed their belongings. Another workshop saw fewer visitors than before. The village felt just a little quieter. Not dramatically, only enough for those who lived there to notice. The blacksmith spent much of his time making final repairs before the voyage. Axes were sharpened. Iron nails secured loose planks. Broken hinges were fixed. Every tool carried aboard the ships would become valuable during the long journey east. Nothing useful could be left behind without careful thought. Iron remained far too precious. One calm afternoon, a small group climbed a nearby hill overlooking the settlement. From there, the entire village could be seen. The turf roofs blended gently into the surrounding landscape. Thin streams of smoke rose from a handful of chimneys. Boats rested quietly beside the shore. Beyond them stretched the endless Atlantic. The view was beautiful, peaceful, almost impossible to imagine as the setting for one of history's enduring mysteries. To the people standing on that hill, however, there was no mystery. There was simply life. Ordinary days filled with ordinary responsibilities. History often transforms simple lives into great questions centuries later. The people themselves rarely realize they are becoming part of history. As preparations continued, encounters with nearby indigenous communities remained infrequent. Occasionally, distant canoes appeared across the water before disappearing once more. Sometimes fresh footprints crossed muddy trails after rain. Both peoples continued sharing the same landscape while maintaining respectful distance. The archaeological evidence suggests that the Norse occupation remained relatively brief. Whatever relationships existed here, peaceful, cautious, or occasionally tense, they belonged to a short chapter in a much longer human history of this land. One evening, several elders gathered outside as the sun slowly disappeared beneath the western horizon. The conversation turned toward memory. Someone recalled Greenland's rocky coastline. Another remembered Iceland's volcanic hills. One elderly sailor spoke quietly about Norway, where he had spent his childhood decades earlier. The younger settlers listened with interest. Some of them had never seen those distant places. Their memories belonged instead to this northern shore, the forests, the bay, the houses built by their own families. It is one of history's quiet ironies that children often accept a new homeland more quickly than adults. To them, home is where they grow, where they play, where they learn the names of birds and rivers. For many of the youngest villagers, this distant settlement had become exactly that. Leaving it would mean saying goodbye to the only world they truly remembered. The following morning, the weather remained unusually calm. Gentle waves rolled against the shore. A light breeze filled the air. Experienced sailors exchanged thoughtful glances. Conditions like these could not be taken for granted. The Atlantic often changed without warning. If departure was going to happen, nature itself seemed to be offering an opportunity. The loading of supplies continued. Barrels of drinking water, food preserved during the summer, tools wrapped carefully inside leather, warm clothing for the voyage. Everything had its place. Every pound of weight mattered aboard a ship crossing thousands of miles of open ocean. Still, not everyone prepared to leave. Several families quietly continued stacking firewood beside their homes. Others repaired fences. A few even expanded storage buildings. Their actions suggested confidence that life here would continue. Perhaps they believed new ships would arrive next year. Perhaps they simply trusted the lands that had already sustained them. Or perhaps they hoped the settlement would someday grow into something larger. History cannot tell us exactly what they expected. It can only reveal what eventually happened. As the days passed, the shoreline became a place of mixed emotions. Some villagers walked there to inspect the ships. Others came simply to watch the sea. Every wave moving eastward seemed to carry thoughts toward Greenland. Every wave returning westward reminded them how far from home they truly were. Then, one cool morning before sunrise, activity quietly spread across the settlement. People moved carefully between the houses. Final bundles were carried aboard the waiting ships. Friends embraced. Children climbed onto the decks. No dramatic farewell echoed across the bay. Only the ordinary sadness that accompanies every difficult goodbye. The sails were raised slowly as the first light touched the horizon. The long ships drifted away from the familiar shoreline. Those who remained stood silently, watching until the vessels became smaller against the endless Atlantic. Some believed they would meet again. Some probably knew they might not. The sea accepted the ships without explanation. Within hours, they had disappeared beyond the horizon. The village still remained. Smoke continued rising from several houses. Fishing boats still rested near the shore. Life had not ended, yet something important had changed forever. The community that remained was smaller now, quieter, more isolated than ever before. And although no one standing there could have known it, the settlement had entered its final chapter. In the next part, we will quietly explore the last known days of the Viking village, as the remaining families face increasing isolation and the settlement slowly begins its gentle journey into history. The village felt quieter after the ships departed. Nothing dramatic had changed overnight. The same waves continued rolling against the rocky shore. The same seabirds circled above the bay. The same morning mist drifted slowly across the water before the rising sun carried it away. And yet, for those who remained, the silence was impossible to ignore. Several houses now stood empty. Their doors were closed. Their fireplaces had grown cold. Footpaths that had once been worn smooth by daily footsteps were beginning to disappear beneath fresh grass. The settlement was still alive, but it no longer felt as busy as it once had. The remaining families quickly settled back into their routines. There was little choice. Fishing nets still needed mending. Firewood still had to be gathered before another winter. The livestock still depended upon daily care. Life in the north never paused simply because people were uncertain about the future. Each morning began much as it always had. Smoke rose from the occupied houses. Children carried water from nearby streams. Hunters disappeared into the forests before sunrise. The blacksmith continued repairing the few iron tools that remained. Every day looked ordinary. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. History often imagines abandoned places as scenes filled with panic or tragedy, but many settlements fade much more quietly. Life simply becomes smaller, fewer voices, fewer fires, fewer people working together. Little by little, a community changes until one day it is no longer there. The settlers who remained had already survived challenges that would have seemed impossible to many others. They had crossed one of the world's most dangerous oceans, built homes in an unfamiliar land, endured northern winters, learned new coastlines and forests. If anyone possessed the determination to continue, it was these people. Still, determination alone could not solve every problem. The greatest challenge was no longer food. The forest still provided game. Fish continued filling the nearby waters. Fresh water remained plentiful. Instead, the settlement faced something less visible: isolation. Every passing season separated the village a little further from the rest of the Norse world. If another ship failed to arrive, there would be fewer opportunities to replace worn tools, fewer chances to exchange news, fewer possibilities for new settlers to strengthen the tiny community. A settlement does not survive through food alone. It survives through connection. Back in Greenland, other Norse farms supported one another. Families traded livestock, neighbors helped repair buildings, communities shared knowledge during difficult years. Here, the little village stood almost entirely alone. One afternoon, several settlers gathered outside the blacksmith's workshop. A familiar axe had finally worn beyond repair. The iron had been reshaped so many times that very little remained. The blacksmith examined it carefully before quietly shaking his head. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was only a tool, yet everyone understood its meaning. Every piece of iron lost made the settlement just a little more fragile. Nothing could be wasted. Broken nails were saved. Fragments of damaged knives became fishhooks. Even the smallest pieces found new purpose. Modern archaeology has revealed just how valuable iron was to the Norse. At Lance Meadows, evidence of iron production demonstrates that the settlers worked hard to supply themselves. Yet, local production could never replace every resource normally obtained through trade with Greenland and beyond. The remaining families understood this reality, even if they rarely spoke of it. As another winter approached, practical decisions filled every day. More fish were preserved. Additional firewood was collected before heavy snow returned. Children, now older than when they first arrived, worked confidently beside their parents. They no longer needed constant instruction. Experience had become their teacher. The settlement itself reflected that experience. Every building carried signs of repair. Every path revealed countless journeys between house and workshop. Every wooden beam showed the marks of careful hands. Nothing was built carelessly. Everything represented patience. Everything represented hope. Yet, hope alone cannot prevent change. The village had already begun shrinking. No new settlers arrived. No larger community grew around it. Its future depended entirely upon a handful of families facing another northern winter alone. As another quiet night settled earlier each evening, warm light glowed once again behind the turf-covered walls. Families gathered around familiar fires, stories filled the long nights. Children listened, adults quietly planned for tomorrow. Outside, the wind moved gently across the empty houses whose owners had already sailed away. Grass slowly crept over unused footpaths. The settlement remained peaceful. It remained beautiful, but it also felt increasingly temporary. No one living there could imagine that nearly 1,000 years later, people would travel from around the world searching for these very foundations beneath the grass. To the settlers, this was simply home. To history, it was becoming a mystery. And as another quiet night settled over the little Viking village, its final chapter drew ever closer, not through violence or sudden disaster, but through the slow, ordinary passage of time. In the next part, we will quietly step forward many centuries to discover how archaeologists uncovered the forgotten remains of this remarkable Norse settlement, finally confirming that Viking explorers had reached North America long before anyone expected. Even after the discovery at Lance and Meadows, one question continued to linger in the minds of historians. Why did the Norse presence in North America end so quickly? The evidence clearly shows that Vikings reached this land, built a small settlement, and lived there for a brief period around the year 1000. But unlike Greenland or Iceland, this place never became a lasting colony. It faded, quietly, without leaving behind written explanations. To understand that ending, historians look carefully at several overlapping factors rather than a single cause. The first and most obvious challenge was distance. The voyage from Greenland to North America was long, uncertain, and dependent entirely on weather conditions. Even experienced sailors faced storms, shifting winds, and dangerous seas. A single journey could take weeks, and returning home was never guaranteed on a fixed schedule. For a small settlement, this created a fragile reality. If ships did not arrive regularly, isolation became total. No reinforcements, no new supplies, no replacement for lost tools or damaged materials. Everything had to be reused, repaired, or carefully rationed. The second challenge was sustainability. While the land offered forests, rivers, and wildlife, it was unfamiliar territory. The Norse were skilled farmers and sailors, but they were not yet fully adapted to this environment. Greenland itself had already been a difficult settlement, and North America presented an entirely new set of conditions. The seasons were different. The ecosystems were different. Even the available resources, while abundant in some ways, required knowledge the newcomers did not yet fully possess. Then there was the question of relationships. Archaeological and historical evidence strongly suggests that the Norse encountered indigenous peoples during their time here. These interactions were likely complex, at times cautious, at times peaceful, at times uncertain or tense. Even limited misunderstandings between small groups can have lasting consequences in isolated environments. In a place where every resource mattered, trust was essential, but difficult to build quickly between cultures with no shared language. A third factor was internal decision-making. The Norse settlers were not part of a single unified empire with centralized control. They were small groups of families and explorers making practical decisions based on survival. Some may have wanted to stay longer. Others likely preferred returning to Greenland, where established communities already existed. Greenland, though harsh, was familiar. It had churches, farms, trade routes, and social structure. North America, in contrast, remained uncertain and distant. When a settlement depends on voluntary cooperation rather than strict authority, decisions like continuing or leaving often reflect caution more than ambition. And caution in harsh environments is often the safer choice. Over time, these pressures likely combined. Delayed or irregular contact with Greenland made the settlement feel more isolated. Environmental challenges made survival demanding. Uncertainty about relationships with nearby peoples added tension. And the difficulty of maintaining repairs, supplies, and morale in such a remote place made long-term occupation increasingly impractical. Eventually, the simplest solution was also the most realistic one. Leave while it was still possible. Return to Greenland while ships could still safely cross the Atlantic. History does not record a single moment when that decision was made. There was no final meeting preserved in writing, no dramatic farewell captured by a chronicler. Instead, what we see is the result of gradual change. Some families left earlier, others stayed longer. Over time, the settlement quietly emptied, and nature did what it always does. It filled the space again. Grass grew over footpaths, wood decayed, structures collapsed, wind and weather erased nearly every visible trace. What remained was hidden beneath the soil, waiting for centuries to pass before rediscovery. From a broader historical perspective, the disappearance of the Viking settlement does not represent failure. It represents limitation. The Norse were extraordinary sailors and explorers, capable of reaching across vast oceans. But exploration does not always lead directly to permanent settlement. Sometimes it leads to knowledge, sometimes to temporary contact, sometimes to routes that are later forgotten or abandoned. In that sense, the voyage to North America still mattered greatly. It expanded the known world. It proved that the Atlantic could be crossed. It connected distant regions, even if only briefly. And it left behind a quiet archaeological footprint that would eventually reshape how we understand global history. Today, when we look back at lawns and meadows, we are not seeing the end of a failed colony. We are seeing the edge of human exploration in its early form. A moment when the limits of the known world were being tested carefully and cautiously by small groups of people following curiosity and survival at the same time. As the final Norse ships likely sailed away from the Newfoundland coast, they carried more than supplies and people. They carried experience, knowledge of new lands, memory of forests across the ocean, and the understanding that the world was larger than previously imagined. But they did not return to build something permanent there. They returned to what they already knew. And so the village disappeared, not in a single moment, but in the slow retreat of people who had briefly stepped beyond the edge of their familiar world. Long after the last Norse ships disappeared beyond the horizon, the coastline of Newfoundland returned to its quiet rhythm. Waves continued to roll in from the Atlantic, just as they had for thousands of years before any human settlement. Seasons changed, forests grew, snow covered the land each winter and melted again each spring. Life moved forward without pause. The small Viking settlement that once stood there did not leave behind grand monuments or written records carved in stone. It left something far more subtle. Traces, hidden beneath the earth, waiting patiently for discovery. When archaeologists finally uncovered those remains nearly 1,000 years later, they were not simply digging into soil. They were uncovering a forgotten moment in human history, one that had quietly slipped out of collective memory and survived only in fragments of old sagas. What makes this story remarkable is not just that Vikings reached North America, it is how human their presence was. They were not mythical figures or legendary conquerors in this place. They were families, workers, sailors, people trying to survive in an unfamiliar land. They built shelter using what they knew. They repaired tools. They gathered food. They adapted as best they could. And then, when the challenges became too great or too uncertain, they made the practical decision to leave. There is something deeply realistic in that ending. No dramatic collapse, no single defining catastrophe, just a series of human choices shaped by distance, environment, and uncertainty. In many ways, that makes the story even more powerful, because it reflects how most of history actually unfolds, quietly, gradually, through decisions made by ordinary people who never realize they are shaping the future. Today, the site at Lands Olmedo stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, carefully preserved so that future generations can understand what once happened there. Reconstructed turf houses allow visitors to see how the settlement may have looked. Low wooden frames support thick walls of earth and grass. Simple interiors remind us how closely people once lived with fire, smoke, and shared space. Standing there, it is easy to imagine the soundscape of the past, the crackle of burning wood, the distant call of seabirds, the steady wind moving across open water. But what cannot be reconstructed is the feeling of uncertainty that must have existed among those who lived there. The awareness that they were far from home, far from familiar support, and dependent entirely upon each other and the land around them. That emotional reality is perhaps the most important part of the story, because it reminds us that exploration has always carried both wonder and risk. The Viking journey to North America represents one of the earliest known crossings of the Atlantic by Europeans, but it also represents something more universal: the human desire to go beyond the horizon, to see what lies farther than the maps show, to test the limits of the known world even when success is uncertain. In that sense, the settlement did not truly disappear. Its impact continued in a different form. Centuries later, when historians and archaeologists pieced the story together, it changed how we understand global exploration. It showed that contact between continents was possible far earlier than once believed. It connected Norse sagas with physical evidence. It added depth to stories that had once been considered legend. And it reminded us that history is not fixed. It evolves as new discoveries come to light. The people who once lived in that small village could not have known any of this. They could not have imagined that their tools would be studied in museums, that their hearths would be mapped by archaeologists, that their journey would become part of world history textbooks. To them, it was simply life at the edge of the world they knew. As the final chapter of their presence closed, the land itself remained unchanged. The sea continued its endless motion. The forests continued to grow, and time, as it always does, moved forward without waiting for memory. Yet somewhere beneath that quiet landscape, the story remained preserved, not in monuments, not in written records, but in the soil itself, waiting for centuries until someone asked the right questions and looked in the right place. And when they did, a forgotten village spoke again, not with words, but with evidence of lives once lived. Today, as we reflect on this story, it is not the disappearance of the village that stays with us. It is the brief moment when it existed, a small community of Norse explorers standing at the edge of an unknown continent, trying to build a life in a place no European had ever permanently settled before. Their time there was short, but its meaning is lasting, because it reminds us that history is not only about what endures, it is also about what is discovered, remembered, and understood long after it has quietly vanished. And so the Viking village that vanished before dawn is not truly gone. It lives on in archaeology, in history,
and in every question we continue to ask about how far human curiosity can travel. As the story comes to an end, the sea remains, the wind remains, and the horizon continues to call forward new explorers, just as it did 1,000 years ago. And with that, the quiet story of the forgotten Viking village gently closes, leaving behind not silence, but understanding.